Hey, I'm so glad to be with you again this Sunday as we kick off February, right? We're kicking off February, and we're going to start a new series called Join the Conversation. And I know you're probably thinking, what kind of conversation am I talking about, right? What kind of conversation are we being invited to? I mean, for some of us, the conversation started with Puxatawny Phil this morning, right? We were watching the news, and he came out of his little house, and, they're trying to figure out, do you see your shadow? Do you not see your shadow in woodchuck talk? And turns out he didn't see his shadow, which means we're having an early spring. At least that's a big thing in Michigan, right? Because we have this ridiculously cold weather and all this white stuff that's piled up ridiculously high right now. And, it snowed on Friday, and you're like, we had winter. I was like, friends, that's not winter, okay? That's not winter, all right? Or maybe the conversation involves who's going to win Super Bowl 54 between the Chiefs and the 49ers. Now, just a question. I don't want to cause any fights this morning. Does anybody think the Chiefs are going to win? Yes, okay, all right. Does anybody think the 49ers are going to win? I love it. I see that hand, right? Awesome. Courageous, brave, yeah. And some of us were like, nah, we don't really care. Our conversation's going to revolve more around who's going to be there and what's on the menu because we like snacks, right? We want to eat, or maybe you want to watch the commercials and see what's funny and what's not funny. But that's maybe the conversation you're going to have. But I want to while those are fun conversations, I want to invite you this month to join into a different kind of conversation. You see, the conversation I want to invite you to join is all about relationships. Because we celebrate this little holiday in February called Valentine's Day. And some of us, have mixed feelings about Valentine's Day. For us, it's really Single Awareness Day. That's what it is, right? Because we haven't found that special someone yet. And for others of us, it's like we had that special someone in our lives, but now they're gone. And so it's hard. It's a little bit different tone of a day. And so whatever your context is this morning for you, I want to invite you to join this conversation because I want to encourage you this morning, right, that these conversations aren't just dealing with romance, right? They're dealing with friendships. And whatever stage you are in life right now, wherever you find yourself in whatever context, I think you're going to find something in these next 4 weeks really, really enjoying, really, really engaging. In fact, I remember Valentine's Day being one of my favorite holidays when I was growing up as a little kid. And, I was like 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. I didn't know what a girl was. We still had cooties and stuff back then. And Valentine's Day was this fun day where we would go to our classroom and we would get crepe paper and construction paper and little boxes. And we would make these mailboxes with markers and glitter and stickers and stars. And we write our names on those mailboxes. And then we'd go to the store. Our parents would bring us to the store and we'd buy these sweet Valentine's Day cards, right? In fact, Ashley and I just went to the store and did this with our daughter, Kaylin, because she's probably having a Valentine's Day party this week. And you buy these cards, right? And they're super fun. They're super fun. They've got all these kinds of characters on them and different things like that. And then they all have a really encouraging saying on them, like, you look good, or you're awesome, or I love you, or something like that. And that's a super big encouragement for the recipient. And everybody in your class gets one. And then oftentimes on the note or cards of encouragement, there would be something even better, even sweeter, which would be a piece of candy, right? Sometimes you get a heart-shaped sucker, or sometimes maybe you get some double bubble or something like that. And one of my favorite pieces of candy to get during Valentine's Day is these little boxes of conversation hearts. Now, I like the original flavor conversation heart. Many of you might think they taste like chalk, but I enjoy it. Okay, now they have fruit flavored, but I love these, right? They're so fun. You can make sentences with them. They have these little words and sayings on them like best friend, kiss me, marry me, sweet talk. And again, it wasn't about romance. It was about fun. It was about friendship. It was a way to encourage and value one another, which is really what I'm hoping to get across in these next couple of weeks. How to value each other in our different relational contexts. Because everybody's at a different stage. And friends, this is so important to me. I believe it's important to Jesus. Because in the words of the great prophet Theodore Roosevelt, just kidding, right? In the words of Theodore Roosevelt, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. You see, we don't want to be another friendly church. We don't want to be another friendly church. I'm betting there are hundreds of friendly churches around in our county and community. We don't want to be just another friendly place because there are lots of friendly places. Man, I go into Walmart and people greet me. Okay, there are lots of friendly places out there. Rather, we want to take it a step further, and we want to be a church where people actually make friends. Amen. Like when you come in the door, people are there, and they actually care about you. So today, that's the conversation that I'm inviting you to join, is how to be a good friend. And the scripture teaches us in Proverbs 17:17 that a friend loves at all times, and a brother is born for a time of adversity. In other words, a friend or a true friend is not just on Facebook, but there's somebody who's with you through good times and somebody with you when times aren't so good, through bad times. And immediately, when I think about this kind of a friend, my mind is drawn to a relationship that we see in history in the Bible between two best friends by the name of David and Jonathan. A friendship that we see spanning the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And just to give you a little bit of a backdrop, David was a shepherd boy, the youngest and smallest of his family. He's just a little runt. In fact, when his brothers were off fighting in the king's army, David was the runt who was left behind to watch his father's few sheep because he didn't quite meet the criteria for being in the army. He was too young. He was too little. But Jonathan, on the other hand, he wasn't a shepherd boy. He had a little bit more noble of an upbringing. He was the king's son. King Saul, who if you recall, was chosen because he was head and shoulders above any other in his tribe or clan. His physical stature was big. So we can assume that being the son of this king and having the same DNA and traits and those kinds of things, he was a pretty big guy. He probably shared some of the same stature. In fact, we'll learn a little bit later that he even had his own sword, hinting that he was big enough to handle one. He could handle a sword. And so just to set the setting here, set the scene, little David has accomplished the unthinkable. And if you know the story, you probably know what I'm referring to, but we'll get there in a little bit. And these two first meet, Jonathan and David, when David earns the right to be in the king's presence. And this is where we see it in 1 Samuel chapter 18. Scripture says in verse 1 of chapter 18, after David had finished talking with Saul, who was the king, Jonathan, his son, became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And from that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off his robe that he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic, his sword, and even his bow. So you have this, Jonathan, who's a pretty big guy, and he's got this robe, and he's got a sword, and he lays it down at David's feet. This shepherd boy who doesn't meet the criteria of fitting in the king's army. And I don't know about you, but when I read that passage, there's a huge question that jumps out at me. And it's why would Jonathan, the heir to the throne, the son of the king, do this? What was it about David that Jonathan so valued? Why was he drawn to befriend David in the way that he did? And I believe we discover the answers to these questions in the surrounding chapters, which then shed light for us on how we can be the kind of friend and have the kind of friendships that David and Jonathan had. The kind of friendship where we're friends through thick and thin. Those really meaningful friendships. And the first key to being a good friend that I believe Scripture sheds light on happens just prior to chapter 18, in the last verse of chapter 17, where King Saul asks David this question: "Whose son are you, young man?" And David responds, "I'm the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." And this is what we begin to learn about David right here, is the first instance of it. And that's David was humble. You see, a key to being a good friend is humility. A good friend will think of others more than themselves. A good friend will think of others more than themselves. And we see this evidence throughout David's life. Even though in chapters prior to this encounter with Saul, he was anointed king over Israel by the prophet Samuel. He was anointed king over Israel by the prophet Samuel. Like, this happens before this encounter. He's anointed king, and then he goes into the king's presence. And he doesn't say, "Hey, what's up? I'm the future king." He doesn't do that. He goes in and he says, "I am the son of your servant Jesse." Right? In other words, he's placing himself in a position of servitude. And in chapters after this encounter with Saul, we see David continuing to serve Saul and come under his leadership. In fact, he served in the king's army. And even as a young boy, he would play the lyre when Saul would get agitated and overwhelmed and stressed out to calm him. And then Saul offered his daughter's hand in marriage to David, an opportunity for him to politically advance himself. And when offered that opportunity, he responds by saying, "Who am I? Who am I that I should become part of the king's family, that I should become your son?" Because you see, although David was the rightful king, and there were ways that he could advance himself, he didn't see himself that way. He didn't see himself that way. He saw himself as a servant. He had an attitude of humility. Now, when I was growing up, and maybe a little bit today still, they kind of don't have it really anymore, but I used to love watching Saturday morning cartoons. I used to love that. Right? You turn on ABC, CBS, Fox, one of those three main stations, somebody was playing Saturday morning cartoons, right? 7 in the morning till noon. And I would just get up, sit out on the floor, get a box of cereal, and just watch cartoons. And sometimes the box of cereal would be gone by the time I was done. And I loved it. And you know, my dad, he didn't really understand. He was like, "You enjoy this?" He wasn't mean about it. He just didn't get it. He's like, "You know this isn't real, right? Why aren't you watching something like football or a hunting show or going outside?" And I was like, "Dad, you just don't get it." And really, he didn't get it. And so I decided at a very young age that when I was a dad, I was going to be one of those dads who watches cartoons with his kids. And so years later, I became a dad. And I would watch cartoons with my kids. And I want to just be honest here today. Cartoons today have nothing on cartoons back then, right? Back then you had fantastic shows like Batman the Animated Series. You had Spider-Man. You had Cowboys of Mumesa. Some of you don't even know what that is right now. Okay, but you had all these incredible shows that you would watch on TV. I mean, you had Bugs Bunny, you had Looney Tunes, you had Daffy Duck, you had Yosemite Sam, and I know those are probably reruns, but I loved them as a kid. And now today, I mean, we get all this weird stuff, and it's not even funny. But you know, there is a cartoon that I watch with my kids that I really love, and don't get too excited this morning, but it's called Paw Patrol. All right? I love watching this cartoon with my kids, and my kids love Paw Patrol. And one of the things I love about Paw Patrol is that When you're watching the show, it's like no matter how busy these little pup friends are, whenever something happens in their community, whenever there's a problem, whenever there's a struggle, they stop everything that they're doing and they go help. They go help. In fact, there's a line in the theme song of the show that says, "No job's too big, no pup's too small. When you need help, just call Paw Patrol." And as you watch the show, you notice that everybody loves the Paw Patrol. They have great relationships with most everybody in the town. There's like this one mayor from a neighboring town with these kitties, and he's kind of mean, okay? But they help everybody out. And they're having fun while they're doing it. And I look at our culture today, and I just think, you know what? There's a lot of people who could really benefit by just sitting down and watching a couple of episodes of Paw Patrol. Because a core value of Paw Patrol is humility. Just as humility is a core component of being a good friend. You see, a good friend will think of others more than themselves. It's why Jonathan was drawn to David. It's why people were drawn to Jesus. And it's how we too can be a good friend to those we encounter on a regular basis. And I don't know what that looks like in your context. Okay, maybe at home it means doing the dishes or taking out the trash or folding the laundry or letting your friends, at school and events, and you're waiting in line for something, and you're letting somebody go ahead of you in line. In your workplace, maybe it means taking the job or the task that nobody else really wants to do, and you're just going to serve everybody else in that way. The whole point of this being, when you put others first, your friendships will grow. You'll grow in your relationships when you exercise humility. You want to be a good friend? Exercise humility. Think of others first. Now, there's a second reason I believe Jonathan was drawn to friendship with David, and I believe that is because the text shows us that David stood up for people. David stood up for what was right. Back in 1 Samuel 17, when David was bringing food to his brothers and inquiring about their well-being, he encountered a scene where Israel was being taunted by one of the Philistines' strongest warriors, the champion Goliath. And this warrior would come out day after day, and he would taunt the people, threatening to enslave them, laughing at them, and mocking their God. And David, this little shepherd boy, this little guy who's not big enough to be in the king's army, he comes out and he says, "This isn't right." And nobody else is willing to stand up. They're all too afraid. And David says, "This isn't right. I'll stand up on your behalf. I'll stand up on behalf of you. I'll stand up on behalf of God." And this little shepherd boy who took care of these few measly sheep, armed with a rock and a sling, went out to fight this man who was over 9 feet tall, described as having a spear like the shaft of a weaver's rod. I mean, this is a big dude, and David is the only one willing to stand up. The only one. Just the point being, a good friend stands up for you. A good friend stands up for what's right. I remember back in middle school having a friend named Joey. And one day, Joey and I were walking down the hall, and there was this girl in front of us who had hip surgery. I don't know why she had hip surgery, but she had hip surgery, and so she was on crutches. And she was walking in front of us on crutches, and then there was another kid in the school who came in from the side, and I observed this kid to be bigger and stronger than both of us. He could probably beat us up if he wanted to. This is just my perspective. But not only that, I observed him as having the willingness to actually do it, right? It's one thing to observe the ability, but it's another thing to observe the attitude. If we mess with this guy, he's actually going to wipe the floor with us. And this guy comes in, and he tries to kick this girl's crutch out from underneath her so she'll fall. And it happened so quick. And I remember him coming in, and he kicked once and missed. And Joey shoves this guy across the hallway. And I thought, oh my goodness, Joey's gonna die. Right? I thought that was the end of his life. He just shoved this guy out of the way. And the guy responded totally how I thought he was going to. I mean, he came back. He had his arms cocked. His chest was all puffed out. He kind of looked like a turkey, right? And he was just ready to kill Joey. And Joey even was like ready to get killed. He was just kind of like, don't hit me. And the guy, like after he established his dominance, just kind of backed off and walked away. And you know what? I never forgot that moment. Because you know what? Joey inspired me. Joey inspires me to be that kind of person, to stand up when something isn't right, to stand up for other people when they're not being treated right and willing to do something about it. And maybe it's in your life, it's not the middle school bully, okay? I think most of us are a little bit older than middle school now. Maybe some of us are still in middle school, okay? But most of us are out of middle school. But you know, in life, it doesn't change very much. Sometimes it's just in a different context. You know, we're at our workplace, and there's that guy who always gets the not fun jobs. There's the guy who works hard or who's annoying or who nobody wants to be around, right? And people kind of treat him differently. He's treated as kind of less than everybody else. Or maybe it's that lady at work, right, who's always intentionally left out of things, pushed to the side, or gossiped about. And I know this all still happens. I mean, even in college, we're surrounded by tons of people. There are still people who are isolated and lonely in the middle of the crowd. The ones who get ignored, who get pushed aside, who when something happens to them, nobody else is willing to notice. And I wonder, when we see instances of people who are mistreated or not treated right, do we, kind of just put our head down and look the other way and pretend we don't notice and hope somebody else will step in? Or do we engage and ask, how can we help? How can we help? Because that's what a good friend does. A good friend wants to know how they can help. A good friend stands up for what's right, stands up for you, thinks of others first. But then also, as we understand in verse 3, we read, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. And that's interesting. We don't use that word covenant very much anymore, but it really means promise. You see, a good friend keeps their promises. Covenant is a fancy word for promise. And I'm assuming this covenant, this promise, had to do with their friendship as specifically mentioned in verse 42 of chapter 20. They made a covenant of friendship with each other, a promise of friendship with each other. They used to, don't do this ever, but I remember this when I was growing up. They used to do these things that they would call blood brothers. And you'd make like a cut in your hand, and you'd like put your hands together so that the blood would mix, and you'd be like blood brothers, right? Don't do that, okay? All right, that's not a good or a wise thing to do. But that's the promise that they were making to each other. And so again, we notice throughout the historical account of David captured in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel that even when David has the opportunity to harm Saul, to harm Saul's family, to harm Jonathan's family, to set up his rightful rule, he doesn't. He doesn't. I mean, there's this one time where Saul is in a cave and he's either sleeping or relieving himself. And David comes in and cuts off the corner of his robe. And he does that as a way of saying, I am not your enemy. I only want good for you. I don't want evil for you. I don't want bad for you. And in the context, you have to understand, Saul is angry with David. He sees God blessing David, and he doesn't want his kingdom ripped away from him. So he is pursuing David. He's trying to kill David. But David made a promise to Jonathan that they were going to be friends. They weren't going to be enemies. And he's going to keep his promise. In fact, he also made a promise to serve the king as he was given a rank in the king's army. And still, even when branded this enemy and chased and pursued, he refused to harm the king. You see, back in those days, it was a typical practice that when a new dynasty or family line took over a throne, in order to establish the throne and eliminate all potential threat from the previous ruling family, the new king or power would have the entire family line of the previous ruler wiped out. everyone would be killed. But David didn't do that. David didn't go that direction because he made a promise. He made a promise to his friend Jonathan that he would treat him and his family well. He showed the family of Saul kindness, even taking it a step further, that when people who were in favor of David being king did harm to Saul's family, David would have them punished. Because David was a man of integrity. He wanted to live up to his promise. Jonathan's friend who made a promise and kept it, because a good friend will keep their promises. And that kind of reflects over to us, doesn't it? Are we going to be the kind of friends that keep our promises? When we say we're going to do something, are we really going to do it? Are we going to follow through? Or is this one of those things where we kind of flex the rules when, it seems advantageous to us? Make an excuse for why we can't. Yeah, I'll go and I'll participate in that event or that activity, or I'll serve this family in that way. Oh, wait, something else came up. Sorry, I can't make it. Have you been there? Have you had those kinds of friends? I remember making plans to go fishing with a friend of mine one weekend last year. And I was looking forward to it. We were going to stay up all night fishing, and I had no idea how I was going to make it because I don't stay up all night. But we were going to do it, and I was going to go with him. And like the day before, he calls me on the phone, and he says, hey, a buddy of mine just called, and he really wants to go fishing. And, there's not really room for two of us or three of us, and I don't get a chance to fish with him much. So, would it be okay if maybe I took him fishing and we'll go another time? And, I wasn't mad. I wasn't angry. And it was okay, right? And I just said, yeah, that's fine. That's okay. We can go another time. But deep down inside, I felt a little bit like I got kind of kicked to the curb. Like I wasn't that important. And the reason I felt that way, friends, is because integrity matters. Integrity matters. If you want to be a good friend, it matters. If you want to have the wide influence that God is calling us to have, it matters. Your promises matter. Your word matters. Now, there's a fourth way to be a good friend that we see in this passage. The fourth reason Jonathan was drawn to David as a friend, why he was willing to give him his robe and lay down his sword at his feet, and that is because David courageously followed after God. And I think this is the most important point. David courageously followed after God. You see, not only will a good friend think of others more than themselves, stand up for you, stand up for what's right, keep their word, be a person of integrity, but a good friend will help you grow in your relationship with Jesus. A good friend's going to help you grow in your relationship with Jesus. Jonathan had to be watching when David went out to face the Philistine champion Goliath. He had to be observing, as we mentioned earlier in 1 Samuel 17. He might have even heard David's response to his father, King Saul, when he was like, why should I let you go fight? And David said, the Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear while tending my father's sheep will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. He knew of his experience and relationship with David, that David trusted the Lord. That's why and how he was so courageous. In fact, we learn of Jonathan himself acknowledging David's faith in the Lord when he says in 1 Samuel 19:5, he, referring to David, took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine, and the Lord won a great victory for all Israel. So when I look at this, there is no doubt in my mind that Jonathan was inspired by David's faith in the Lord, and that was part of the reason he was drawn to him. In my previous church, I had a friend who stopped by my house one day after work, and my wife and I had been praying about starting a connection group for young couples and young families, and when this young man shared with me some of the struggles that he was having, I invited him to join our group. And my thought process was, I'm going to help him grow in his relationship with Jesus. But the longer we were in the group together, the more I saw him growing in his relationship with the Lord. And steadily, I was the one being inspired. He was inspiring me. And our friendship continued to grow. because we both wanted a stronger relationship with the Lord. And then just a couple of weeks before I left to come down here to welcome, I was having coffee with this friend and with another friend. And we were going to pray together. And he looks at me and he says, hey, I want you to give your mom my cell phone number because I know you're not going to be around anymore. And if she needs anything, you just have her call me. And I was just blown away. That meant so much to me. And listen, this isn't to say that there aren't friends who don't love Jesus, who won't do that for you. There are. But I'm pointing out that because of his love for the Lord and my love for the Lord, our relationship grew until we became those kinds of friends. And the beautiful thing about having that kind of relationship with a friend who loves the Lord is that it's lasting. It's never going to end. Just like David and Jonathan. You see, when we follow Jesus, we are heading towards an eternal relationship with him that is never going to end. And because we're pursuing a relationship with him, we will naturally grow in our relationships with every other believer. And that relationship will never end. It will grow. It will be forever. But when we aren't following Jesus, we're headed to a place of physical and spiritual death that is separate from the presence of God. So if I'm headed towards Jesus and my friend is not, our relationship will not last forever. Ultimately, it's going to end, and it's going to end tragically, which is why I can say that if I'm going to be a good friend, if I really want to be a good friend, I'm going to help influence my friends who don't follow Jesus to take a step towards Jesus, towards relationship with him. And if you want to have the best friends that you can possibly have, you're going to have the kind of friends in your life who are also going to help you take steps closer to Jesus. Because that's what true friends do. They want the best for each other. And our best is God's best. Our best is what God's plans for our life are. That's the best we can ever hope for somebody. God's plan for their life. Friends, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And the Holy Spirit, through the scripture, compels us to be that kind of friend. To be that kind of friend on this Groundhog Day, on Super Bowl Sunday, this Valentine's Day, and every day after that. A friend who will think about others. A friend who will stand up for what's right. A friend who has integrity. A friend who will help others take steps towards Jesus. And that's the kind of conversation I'm asking you to join this month and here on out. The DTR conversation. Do you know what the DTR conversation is? It's the define the relationship conversation. What kind of friends are we going to be? What kind of friendships is this church going to build? Because let's face it, folks, Oconee County and our surrounding communities need those kinds of friends that are going to help them take a step with Jesus. They need a best friend. They need Jesus. We need Jesus. Jesus, who is called the friend of sinners. We need a best friend, and it's only by his grace that we can be the best friend that our friends need.